Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it is Friday, April the 18th, 2025. Yesterday we did a show with the Cambridge University neuroscientist Leo Zmigrod, whose new book, The Ideological Brain, The Radical Science of Flexible Thinking, presents the radical ideologies of both the left and the right as kind of like COVID, forms of a pandemic, and they invade our brain, which reflects perhaps the disruption in our politics. As a follow-up, in an odd kind of way, today's conversation is with Nick Troiano. His book, it came out last year, it's just out in paperback, The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes, also treats radical ideology as a kind of political pathology, but rather than invading our brain, it's invaded our political process. Nick is joining us from Denver, where he lives and where his group, Unite America, is based. Nick, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at The Ideological Brain. It's an interesting book and an interesting conversation. In your view, are the radical ideologies of the left and the right in the United States, have they somehow corrupted our political system through primaries?
Well, it's good to be with you. And I would say that pluralism is a feature of our country. You know, the idea that there are many different ideologies and political perspectives, that's a good thing, whether that's far left all the way to far right. The challenge is that in our current election system, it gives disproportionate influence and sort of a megaphone to the fringes of both political parties. And that's largely a result of the way that our primary system is structured and functions today. So the purpose in writing my book was to sort of diagnose that, to the extent that polarization is the biggest challenge facing our democracy and an inability to find common ground to solve problems, that is fundamentally a structural issue. It's the incentives of the system embedded in the way that we elect our leaders, which wasn't put into the Constitution or written in stone 200 years ago. It was invented out of whole cloth since then, and I'm advocating for a continuation of trying to refine and reimagine our election system so that it truly represents a majority of Americans.
Nick, the assumption in America is that the country's becoming more radicalized, that the extremes, obviously on the right, MAGA, but also on the left, have destroyed the center. Are you suggesting that that's wrong, that assumption?
I think that's right, although I think that we are in this sort of self-reinforcing cycle of polarization, and I think that our election system is exacerbating it, meaning the structural challenge is. But to the extent that our elections are producing more polarized leaders that in our information system are getting a lot more attention in terms of clicks online or eyeballs on television, that creates a feedback loop back into the electorate, which is itself also polarizing. So the question is, what do we do to break the cycle? And like I said, there are many inputs into what is fueling this problem, but the biggest solvable one is the election system itself. And we can get more into, what those solutions look like. But the fact is that our challenge in our election system is layered on top of a lot of these other challenges that are less, solvable. Or I'll leave it to others to see if they can get at those other challenges, cultural challenges or technological challenges. It just seems to me that the design of our election system is the one that we can really grapple with in the near term.
So is your book is a critique of the primary system in America. Is it mostly a critique of presidential primaries or a broader critique of just the very nature of primaries where at the state, the local level, the primary system seems to be encouraging extremes?
The book is a critique of party primaries. And by party primaries, I mean the process by which both major political parties choose their nominees that go on to then compete in the general election. What we call the primary problem is the fact that in our elections today, 90% of them on a state and federal level are uncompetitive in the November election, right? Those districts are so lopsided for one party or another. Gerrymandering plays a role there, but the fact is the biggest reason is our own geographical sorting, right? Liberal areas are more urban, conservative areas are more rural, which means that primaries are the whole ballgame. And the outcome of the election is effectively decided in the dominant party's primary. The problem there is that very few people participate in these elections. And in 16 states, these taxpayer-funded government-run elections prohibit independent voters from participating, which means that there are 16 million Americans locked out of these elections. And so the result of all of that is that in Congress, for example, in the last election, only 14% of Americans cast a meaningful ballot, meaning a ballot that was actually determining the outcome of a competitive election. So even though we're happy that turnout might be 50, 60% or higher, very few votes actually matter in determining these elections because of this primary problem. The good news is that is completely fixable through reforms that many states have already begun to try.
How would you respond to the argument, Nick, and I'm sure you've heard it many times, that you can get involved in local politics if you choose to? Most people are simply too lazy or too busy, or perhaps too lacking ideology, too centrist to get involved. They may not identify themselves as part of one political party or the other. And so what the primaries in this country do is reward political participation, which is what democracy is all about. If you want to make the effort, then you should be rewarded for that. And the fact that, at least in your mind, political extremes on the left and right are dominating the system reflects the fact that these people are more committed than centrists.
There's no doubt that those on the political fringes are much more politically engaged, not just in voting, but in donating and contacting their elected representatives and so forth, which means that the rest of us who don't feel represented should get more engaged. But the challenge that I'm talking about is even if we wanted to, the systems and structures of our elections don't allow for it. Even if you're a Republican or Democrat. So for example, imagine that you're a Democrat living in a solidly red state or red district. If that election is decided in the party primary, chances are you can't vote in it. So does your vote actually matter? Even if you can cast your ballot.
But what's I mean, I take your point, Nick, and I don't think many people would argue with you that there's a problem, a structural problem, maybe a sickness with the American political system. Well, what's changed? And is it on both sides? I know a lot of people will argue, particularly probably people who watch this show, that the real problem is with the Republicans, and the Democrats are still perhaps nominating some people on the left. But basically, the problem with the fringe is a Republican problem. In your mind, at your group, at Unite America, is this a bipartisan problem, as much a problem of the left as the right?
I think it's a problem within both political parties, and we've seen that. Actually, the data shows that at the state level, Democrats have been moving further to the left, and at the congressional level, Republicans have been moving further to the right relative to the other political party. And the challenge there is that as both parties do polarize, it leaves less room for finding common ground. The answer here isn't that we necessarily need more centrists or moderates. It's that we need more leaders who are willing to at least talk to and work with the other political party. But that becomes a challenge when it runs into their incentive for how they need to get reelected. If your reelection runs through the most committed 5% of the electorate, which is your base, those voters don't want you reaching across the aisle to get anything done.
So you're not really answering my question, though. Is the problem in your mind as much on the left and the right? I mean, readers of the New York Times, the Washington Post, even the Journal are familiar with the increasing radicalization, magnification of the Republican Party. But you're seeing the same on the Democratic side, in your view?
I don't know that we can say that the challenge is equivalent on both sides, but that doesn't negate there being a challenge on both sides. And what we also see is that how extremism on one side feeds into the other side, polarizing further, and that becomes a cycle right now. And I would say that the most acute problem that we face right now is that the extremism on the right isn't just ideological. It isn't about more conservative policy. It is about some litmus tests around our democratic institutions themselves. We saw this post 2020, for example, when President Trump denied the outcome of the election, tried to stay in office, whipped up a mob on January 6th to try to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power. And what many forget is what he said on the National Mall that day was, if your members of Congress don't fight, we primary them. So this primary problem is being weaponized in a way that is a threat to our democracy.
Wait, I'm not hearing it from the left. I mean, the subtitle of your book is Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes. Maybe a more appropriate subtitle would be Rescuing Our Democracy from the Republican Fringe, because I don't know anyone on the left, even a radical Democrat who's arguing against democracy or overturning elections. So is this really a Republican fringe problem?
Like I said, I don't think the problem is equivalent on both sides, but there is a problem on both sides. And in fact, the chapter that I write about how this has become a threat to democracy begins with observing that the first mainstream election denialism we had was in Stacey Abrams, who refused to concede the governor's race in Georgia, I think going back to 2018, or the approaching majority of Democrats who believed that when Hillary Clinton lost the election in 2016, it was because the Russians actually tampered with ballots, which is demonstrably false. So at any given time, the problem may be more acute on one side or the other, but this disease is embedded in our politics, which is a zero-sum politics when we believe democracy is simply about getting our way. And if we don't like the outcome, then we're willing to trade off on the norms and institutions that we're supposed to share together. So I'm less interested in litigating which party is the bigger problem right now, and more interested in focusing on the fact that we're on an unsustainable path right now in America, where the accumulation of political power matters more than anything else. And this primary system we have is fueling that to a large degree.
I'm interested that you use the word disease, which is, of course, brings to mind again Leo Zmigrod's argument in the ideological brain that ideology is a kind of disease. What's your take on ideology? I mean, you're not a neuroscientist, you're not an expert on ideology, but do you think that both the ideas on the radical left and on the right are a kind of political disease?
No, I mean, I think ideologies are natural insofar as forming a view of the world. I think, though, that where they can get problematic is when people begin to, rationalize backwards from a predetermined worldview rather than trying to make sense of it. It just simplifies it down to a way that I think is not constructive. And the truth is that most Americans, particularly those that don't eat and breathe politics every day, have a nuanced set of political beliefs. They may agree with more progressive ideology on some issues and more conservative ideology on others, but we happen to live in an information and media ecosystem that tends to portray the world as very black and white. And I don't think that's the way that most people do view policy or political issues. And we should have a political system that represents that great diversity of ideology in our country. We don't get that. When you look at the House of Representatives today, for example, at 435 members, there is zero political independence. Half the country is politically independent. How is it the case that 0 of 435 are today, or on one issue or the other, you get party line votes. So our political system isn't expressing the nuance of belief that I think the American people have. And again, that goes back to this structural challenge in our elections.
I'm always a bit suspicious when people use the term American people. I mean, after all, there have been all these third-party movements, beginning with Ross Perot, even beforehand. None of them have ever had any success. Michael Bloomberg was willing to fund one or drive one. There are all sorts of movements designed to bring people together or to create third-party movements, but they've been failures. And what's changed over the last 25 years? Is it the primary system has changed? Is it our political culture? Is it the financing of that culture? Are primaries more dominant, both at a local, state, and national level in 2024 than they were in 2004 or in 1994?
Well, I think what's changed is two big trends in our politics. One is that both parties have become much more ideologically homogenous. You used to have, liberal Northeast Republicans or Southern conservative Democrats. But when we really began to see the polarization in both parties, now you have more concentrated political coalitions that stack different identities on top of each other. So based on the zip code in which you live, that might say a lot about your level of education or religiosity or political party. And so we've just become more tribal in our politics. And so the primary system that used to be more of a first round election, where we're looking at candidates based on their qualifications or experience or issue platform, right now has become more about party dogma and purity to some litmus test of issues. And we haven't seen that before, but that's why primaries didn't used to be a problem, but they are today, because they are existing in a political system that's much more polarized than in the past and much more nationalized, which is to say that even at the local or state level, we see a lot of national politics become the frame through which those elections are, litigated to the public and decided now. And so we have to, refresh the system based on the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And that's nothing new. 100 years ago plus, primaries were not the domain of voters. It was party bosses in smoke-filled rooms handpicking candidates. And both the insiders and the outsiders realized at one point that system was no longer working for them. And so they decided to change it. And that's exactly what I think we need to do today.
I wonder, though, whether we need to be a little careful about being nostalgic about political parties as broad tents. You talked about the Democratic Party that united conservative Southerners and urban ethnic groups of Northerners, but this was a Southern party that turned a blind eye to Jim Crow. So why should we be nostalgic about that kind of broad tent party? And the same can be true, of course, of the Republicans in different contexts, when it lent itself not so much towards justice, but in some ways maintaining the various injustices of the American political system.
Well, I don't think we should be nostalgic for that. I'm glad that we've moved on and our political coalitions have reshaped, the post-civil rights era. But our system itself needs to update as a result of that, because what we have going on today, is not working. And it saps a lot of the diversity that should exist within broad parties. I mean, it was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, herself a product of a primary of an incumbent with just 5% of voters in that district basically deciding it. But she reflected, how is it in any other country she would not be in the same political party or coalition as a Joe Biden, who's a more moderate or pragmatic Democrat, or at least at the time? Or on the right, how is it that, the MAGA faction can exist with, traditionally even socially conservative, Republicans? We actually have a 4 or 5 party system that's being squeezed in a 2-party system. And I don't know that the answer to that is that we need 5 political parties. Many people would like to see that happen, but we at least need to have a two-party system with a greater diversity of belief and representation than we have today. And that representation should be of a majority of the electorate, not just the 10% that dominate these low turnout elections.
What about the people who don't vote? Do they have any rights? I mean, we're talking about 60% of Americans who normally vote, even on national elections. What percentage of Americans vote in local or state elections?
I mean, you can see in off-year elections, 10% turnout, or in midterm elections, 20% turnout. So that's a function of some of these structural barriers, but it's also a function of give people something to vote for. I mean, when you look at the state legislative level, literally 2/3 of elections have only one candidate in both the primary and the general. So you tell me, what is the incentive to turn out and cast your ballot?
Yeah, it's chicken and egg here in terms of figuring out what the problem is. I wonder, Nick, whether there's also a connection between what's happening at the primary level and your critique and the growth of presidential power. We've done a number of shows, as you can imagine, on Trump and Trump's power. And some people have been on the show arguing that it actually represents a continuity of the imperial presidency. Is there a connection between the increasing centralization of power within the executive and this crisis at the primary level that you write about in The Primary Solution?
100%. I mean, I think the political crisis that we're experiencing today is a derivative of the structural crisis in our democracy, whereby Congress has abdicated its constitutional role to be a separate, co-equal branch of government and to be a check on the executive. Every issue that we're seeing right now is largely a result of, the party in power rolling over to the president. And we threw off a king 250 years ago. The founders anticipated the rise of would-be strongmen, but what they did was design a system that was supposed to check power with power. And the challenge is we don't have a separation of powers right now. We have a separation of parties. If your party is in control of Congress and the president, Congress rolls over to do what the president wants. And that's a slippery slope that we've seen under both Democratic and Republican administrations. And that problem is particularly acute today when you have a president that wants to abuse that presidential power. There's no accountability for that in Congress right now, because those members of Congress are fearful that they will be primaried if they stand up to the president. We saw that in the confirmation hearings. We're seeing it through the tariff issue, which was supposed to be a congressional power to begin with in the Constitution. And that problem is going to get worse, over time until we get at this challenge.
But what's wrong with being primaried, and why wouldn't opponents of this increasingly ideological nature of party politics, why wouldn't they want to fight the hardcore MAGA people or some of the equivalents, at least in your mind, on the left? The universities now and even some of the law firms are beginning to stand up to Trump. What's wrong with the primary system, which allows incumbents to be challenged? I mean, one of the other problems with the American political system is it's increasingly not only a gerontocracy, but one that simply is like almost like a hereditary aristocracy.
I don't disagree with you on that point. The solution to that is more competition, right? We shouldn't have leaders that can get elected in safe districts and just hold that seat for the rest of their life or as long as they want to. But the reason why they can is because our system no longer has sufficient competition to hold them accountable. And the answer to that is to increase competition. So let me tell you what the solution looks like, because we haven't really gotten there yet.
I do want to get to that. But one other thing before we get to your solutions, because I know at Unite America, that's what you're focused on. You're an interest group trying to figure out country over party. And you invest in non-partisan electoral reform. But I know you've done some research recently in terms of this dysfunctional system. Do Americans really care, though, Nick? Have you found in your research that most Americans are actually bothered by this system?
Yes. I think if you ask people Their biggest challenge right now, or the biggest issue they see, what we saw in the last election, was democracy. And that's not to say that both sides see that issue the same way. They don't. But I think many Americans are clued into the fact that our system doesn't represent them, that it's very divided and dysfunctional, and it's not producing results on the issues that they care about. What our job needs to be is to help connect that dysfunction down to its structural root causes, because otherwise we are simply going to be stuck in this paradigm of one party versus the other, which is what they want us to be stuck in. That's how they raise money. That's how they get reelected. Whereas I think left, right, center should be united in fundamentally changing this system at its root level so that it can be more representative. And then let's get back to all the policy disagreements that we have with each other.
I take your point. As I said, I want to come to your solutions. But one final question before then. As I said, there have been lots of third-party initiatives, often by well-resourced people, everyone from Ross Perot to Michael Bloomberg to many others today. Why can't wealthy, powerful, well-organized Americans simply create alternative political organizations and ideologies to the two dominant ones? What's wrong with a market-based solution, if you like, to all this?
Well, they can and they should, and some are. I mean, most recently with the Forward Party that launched. And the interesting thing with Forward is that they recognize the structural impediments that exist to new political competition. One reason why we don't see many successful third-party candidates or third parties is the system of the spoiler effect, they call it. I mean, I ran as an independent candidate for Congress in 2014. I experienced this. It's when voters tell you, I really like you, but I am afraid that if I vote for you, it's going to take away a vote from my second preferred candidate and wind up electing the person I least like. That's a phenomenon of our first past the post plurality system. If we had some of the reforms that I'm eager to talk about, it'll level the playing field for new competition. The only thing that both parties agree on right now is to keep the rules as they are because it keeps out everyone else. That's what we have to change if we want to see more efforts outside the two major parties.
We've done a number of shows, Nick, on the reform of the political system, particularly the preferential vote system. Is that the core solution that you're offering, suggesting that rather than at a primary or even at a non-primary level, that people should be able to stack their votes, prioritize their votes, be 1, 2, 3, and that might be the way of breaking the gridlock?
We're primarily focused on open primaries and really promote the system that Alaska adopted in 2014, which combined an open all-candidate primary with an instant runoff election. And it carries both of the benefits of allowing everyone to be able to vote for whomever they want, for 4 candidates to wind up in the general election, and for voters to be able to rank those candidates if they would like in order of preference. Such that the playing field is level for all types of candidates from different backgrounds, and it produces a majority winner. I mean, that is a solution that, if adopted by more states, would produce more and more leaders in Congress who actually represent a true majority of Americans. And I do think that is how Congress as a whole will be able to get more functional over time when we elect those leaders and not only have the personal conviction and courage to govern in such a way, but are actually rewarded rather than punished by their electorate when they do so.
So is that the core initiative that you're pursuing at Unite America, reforming the local system? Can all this be done locally at a state level or even a local level as opposed to the federal level?
The answer is yes, and that's what makes this movement exciting, is that it doesn't require a constitutional amendment or an act of Congress in order to pursue these reforms. In the Constitution says that states can set the time, place, and manner of their elections. And that's why we see different systems used at the state level around the country. Right now, there are 5 states that have abolished party primaries for state or federal elections.
Who are those states? Which are those states?
Yeah, those states are Nebraska, Louisiana, California, Washington, and most recently, Alaska.
And they're not, you would have guessed Oregon and Maine, the normal, or the sort of the small, slightly iconoclastic states. But the fact that California and Louisiana have both passed this initiative is interesting.
And they have some different systems. In Louisiana, there is no primary. All the candidates compete in the general election. There's a runoff. In California, there's a top two system. Everyone's on one ballot in their primary. The top two finishers go to the general, regardless of party. What these systems have in common, though, is that every voter gets the freedom to choose whomever they want at every election, regardless of party, and that whoever gets a majority of votes in the general election wins. And so there are 5 states right now that meet both of those criteria, slightly different systems in them. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the worst offenders, which is right now 16 states that have party primaries that are only open to registered Democrats and Republicans, where if you're an independent, you don't have a right to vote in taxpayer-funded elections. So our work at United America is at the state level, working in state legislatures or sometimes through ballot initiatives to open the primaries, ideally to all voters and to all candidates. But there's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's the beauty of our system of federalism, where we can design solutions that are unique to the states and the problems in those states that they're aiming to solve.
Are there particular states that need a shout out for being particularly problematic?
Well, in the book, I write about the similarity between both Oklahoma and in Massachusetts. Those states are quite different politically, ideologically, but what they have in common is that in the last midterm election, every congressional seat was decided in the primary. In Massachusetts, it was the Democratic primary. In Oklahoma, it was the Republican primary. And in Massachusetts, there was only one candidate on the ballot in each of those congressional primaries. So you tell me if they had an election or not. Surely people cast their ballots, but I don't know a voter whose ballot actually mattered. They didn't have any choice, no competition. And that's something that both Massachusetts and Oklahoma have in common. And on the flip side, the good news is there are groups in both of those states right now exploring potential reforms that would address those problems. And that's what people listening and who want to get involved can do at the state level. Sometimes it requires building strong coalitions, across the political spectrum of people who don't agree with each other on policy, but do agree that we should have a government that represents us.
In a sense, then, are you rather the sort of the political equivalent of groups like Braver Angels? We've done a number of shows on them, bringing people of different political opinions together in terms of reforming the system.
Yes. And in the context of actually changing policy, this isn't only about, which is important, having good conversations with people who may disagree with us. It is about uniting with those folks to go out and make a structural change that will impact who runs for office, the types of leaders that get elected, and how they govern, because their incentives change. And on that last point, I would say, if you gave me an option between replacing all 435 members of the House of Representatives or changing the system that they got elected through, I would choose the latter. And it isn't even close, because right now we're feeding pretty good people into a pretty bad system. And the results of that shouldn't surprise us when we really understand what the incentives are. And, the first thing I learned in Political Science 101 was members of Congress are single-minded seekers of re-election. They will do what it takes to keep their job. It's up to us to make keeping their job in alignment with actually doing their job and producing results on issues that we care about. Right now, those incentives run in the exact opposite direction.
And how will that change politics at the national level? There's so much both hysteria and cynicism about the national level. I don't want to just focus on MAGA and Trump, also on the Democrats. How if all these local reforms begin to happen, if the system is reformed at a local level, how will that manifest itself at the federal level?
Well, every state that adopts, open primaries and all candidate primaries, we believe it will effectively liberate both U.S. senators, several U.S. representatives from those states, who can go on to be part of a coalition of Democrats, Republicans, hopefully some independents in the Congress that could join together to work on policy in the interest of the country. You've heard of the Gang of Six or the Gang of Eight or Gang of 10 before, working on issues like immigration, for example. Well, those are the types of leaders that are that we need more of. We're willing to work with each other. And so importantly, we don't need to win these reforms in all 50 states to see a change in Congress. If we win reforms that could liberate 20 US senators, well, 20 senators in a closely divided Congress have a lot of leverage to be able to do a lot of good. And so this is why, change won't happen overnight, but we can imagine in the next 3, 6, 10 years being able to achieve a vision of having a more representative and functional democracy, because we actually have leaders that want to put country over party to do what is in the best interest of the country.
Nick, you used the L word, liberate. Of course, Donald Trump has made that a word of his own. He talks about Liberation Day, April 2nd, beginning his tariff policy. But are you suggesting that Americans really, if we are to be liberated from a very troubling political environment, a culture, that we have to reform the system?
We have to. Otherwise, we're going to keep hoping for different results and getting the same exact thing. No matter which party's in charge or which leaders get elected, they are going into a system where their incentives runs through being able to play to the base, not really getting anything done, say bombastic things to raise money. I mean, who's that serving right now? So it's sort of like we can keep changing the players in the game, or we can change the rules. And when we change the rules, we can change the behavior. And that's why these structural reforms are so critical to the future, I believe, of our democracy. And that's part of the proud tradition that we've had really since the country's founding.
Well, Nick Troiano, are you the founder of Unite America? You're currently executive director. Best of luck with this. It's an important initiative, and I think I'm not sure everyone will agree with your prognosis that the primaries are the problem or the core problem, but certainly I think everyone will share your concern with the political system, its radicalization, and the fact that people feel increasingly disempowered. So congratulations on the paperback version of The Primary Solution. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Andrew.
Can I step on the sea?